All right, so get ready because today we're going to try to see Baltimore a little differently. We're diving into this article that looks at the city and how photography can be so revealing about inequality in cities,
Right.
but also how it can kind of hide stuff too, especially when you think about gentrification, predatory lending, and deindustrialization.
Oh, yeah. Those are big ones.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So we're looking at Things Pictures Don't Tell Us, In Search of Baltimore by Elvin Wyly. It's from the Journal City back in 2010. And to help us break it all down, we've got our expert here with us.
Glad to be here.
Now, you might be thinking, an article about pictures. That'll be easy. But this one goes way deeper.
Yeah, it really makes you think about what's not in those photos. You know what's going on behind the scenes, especially in a city as complicated as Baltimore.
Exactly. And the article kicks off with something I bet a lot of you will recognize, The Wire, that HBO show. Yeah, the one with those iconic Baltimore images.
Such a powerful show.
But here's the thing. Those pictures, they only tell part of the story.
Right on. The article calls this photographic debt. It's like every photo is a promise to dig deeper, to understand the context, to get the whole story behind that one frozen moment in time.
Okay, photographic debt.
Yeah.
I like that. So how do we even start to pay back this debt, especially when we're talking about a city like Baltimore with all its history?
Well, the article lays out three things that pictures often miss, and more importantly, it gives us some tools to try and figure out what's missing.
Okay, hit me with these three things. This is where it gets good.
All right, so the first one is called conditions of possibility. It sounds kind of complicated, but all it means is understanding the whole story behind the photo.
Yeah.
Like who took it, why, what was going on at the time.
Right, context is key.
Exactly. But it's even more than that. You got to think about what didn't happen, too.
What didn't happen? Now that's interesting.
Think about it. How do you even capture something like disinvestment in a photo? You can see empty buildings, but you don't see the years of neglect, the policies that caused it, the stuff that never even got built.
Wow, that's like trying to take a picture of the wind. You see the effects, but not the wind itself. Okay, so that's conditions of possibility. What's number two?
Number two is displacement. Photos capture one place at one time, but the forces at play might be coming from somewhere else entirely.
Oh, I see what you mean. Like a photo of a protest. You see the people, the signs, the energy. But to really get it, you need to know the history, the policies, the injustices that brought them there.
Exactly. And the article has this great example. It uses a photo of a plaque on a public housing project in Baltimore. It was built during the New Deal.
A plaque. How does a plaque show displacement?
Well, the photo itself might seem simple, but that plaque opens up a whole bunch of questions like what was the New Deal? Why was public housing built there? Who had to move to make room for it? What happened to those people? Suddenly one little photo leads to a much bigger story.
It's amazing how one detail can take you down such a rabbit hole. So conditions of possibility, displacement. What's the third thing? Pictures don't always show us.
The third one, and maybe the most important, is all about power and representation.
Yeah, I can see how that's huge in photography.
Mhm.
We all know a photo can be cropped, edited. Even the caption can totally change the meaning.
Exactly. The article argues that if the people fighting for social justice ignore photography, then the people who benefit from inequality are the ones who get to control the story.
So it's not about avoiding photography. It's about understanding how it can be used and misused, right?
Absolutely. Even photos that seem positive at first glance can be misleading. The article talks about how pictures of fancy new developments can be used to celebrate revitalization, but they often hide the displacement and struggles of the people who got pushed out by gentrification.
That's a really important point. So how does the article use Baltimore as a case study to show all this?
Well, it takes us on these photographic walks through different Baltimore neighborhoods. It uses specific locations and images as starting points to explore much bigger issues.
Okay, I'm hooked. Tell me more. Where does this photographic journey take us?
One of the first stops is the Old American Can Company. It's a huge landmark in Baltimore.
Oh, wow, I remember that place. It was this giant abandoned factory, a symbol of the city's industrial decline. What does the article say about it?
Well, it talks about how that site, like so many others in Baltimore, has been totally changed by gentrification. It used to be a busy factory employing generations of workers, and now it's this upscale office and retail complex for a whole different crowd.
And the article uses photos to help us visualize this transformation.
Yeah, the photos are like pieces of a puzzle. They capture that stark contrast between the old and the new, and they make you think about who benefits from this change and who gets left behind.
It's fascinating how a picture can spark so many questions.
This is great.
Okay, so that's the American Can Company. What other sites does the article explore?
Another powerful example is a photo of the Thank God for Jesus church. It's this little church in a neighborhood that's really struggling. The photo itself is incredibly moving, but the article connects it to this bigger problem of predatory lending practices that often target Black churches.
Hold on, predatory lending. How does a picture of a church show that?
Remember how we talked about displacement? Well, this is a perfect example. The forces shaping this community are coming from outside, often from financial institutions that made money off the housing crisis.
Man, that's heartbreaking. But it's also eye-opening to see how these seemingly separate things are actually all connected. Okay, so we've got the American Can Company, we've got the Thank God for Jesus Church. Are there any other Baltimore places that the article uses to make these points about photography and injustice?
Absolutely. And each one gives a different angle on the city's battles with gentrification, deindustrialization, and inequality. Do you want to dive into those now, or should we save them for the next part of our deep dive?
You know, I always want to keep going, but I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about for now. Let's stop here, and we'll come back in the next part of our deep dive to uncover even more of Baltimore through the lens of this really interesting article. All right, so we're back and ready to keep going on our photographic journey through Baltimore with Elvin Wyly's article as our guide. We've already uncovered so much about how pictures can show and hide inequality in cities. I'm ready to see what other insights we can find.
Great. Well, next we're going to switch gears and look at a place that shows a very different side of Baltimore, Silo Point.
Silo Point. You mean that luxury condo development on the waterfront? I've actually been there. The views are amazing, but it definitely feels like a world away from the neighborhoods we were just talking about.
That's exactly Wiley's point. Silo Point, which was built on the site of an old grain elevator, is a perfect example of those stark class divisions that often pop up in redeveloped areas.
It's like that saying, waterfront views for those with waterfront money.
Exactly. And the photos of Silo Point in the article really highlight that contrast. They show these shiny towers rising up against the backdrop of those older, more industrial parts of the city. And it makes you think about who gets to enjoy these spaces and who gets pushed out.
It's like a visual representation of the inequalities that are often built into urban renewal.
Right. Now get ready for a little jump because our next stop takes us all the way to Hong Kong.
Hong Kong. What does Hong Kong have to do with Baltimore?
This is where the article gets really interesting. Wiley uses a picture of the HSBC bank headquarters in Hong Kong to show how what's happening in Baltimore is actually connected to global financial systems.
It's like that saying, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. But for Baltimore, it's more like, what happens in Baltimore doesn't stay in Baltimore.
Exactly. The article links this photo to the subprime mortgage crisis, which, as we know, hit Baltimore really hard. It argues that the crisis wasn't just a few bad people making bad choices. It was a symptom of a much bigger system that was designed to make a profit, often at the expense of vulnerable communities.
So a picture of a bank in Hong Kong can help us understand the roots of the foreclosure crisis in Baltimore. That's mind-blowing.
And that's the power of Wiley's approach. He's showing us how things that seem totally unrelated are actually interconnected, and how photography can help us see those connections.
It's like we're putting on a new pair of glasses that let us see the world differently.
Now, for our last stops on this photo tour, we're coming back to Baltimore, specifically to the neighborhoods of Poppleton and Franklin Square in West Baltimore.
Those neighborhoods were hit especially hard by the foreclosure crisis, weren't they?
They were, and the article uses pictures of abandoned and rundown homes in these areas to really show the human cost of the crisis.
You mentioned earlier that Wiley's work builds on David Harvey's theory of class monopoly rent. How does that connect to what we're seeing in these pictures from West Baltimore?
That's a great question. Harvey's work helps us understand how the way cities are structured, especially the housing market, can actually create and continue inequality.
Okay, I'm listening.
Harvey argues that powerful people like developers and financial institutions can control access to land and housing. They drive up prices and force out the people who can't afford to stay.
So it's not just about supply and demand. It's about power dynamics.
Exactly. And Wiley applies this theory to the subprime crisis, arguing that it was basically a new way of extracting this class monopoly rent. Wall Street profited from a system that pushed people out of their homes.
It's like that saying, the game might change, but the players stay the same. The specifics might evolve, but the underlying systems of exploitation and inequality are still there.
That's a great way to put it. And these photos from Poppleton and Franklin Square are visual proof of the devastating impact of these systems.
This is all so thought-provoking. It's like Wiley wants us to look past the surface of these pictures and see the bigger forces at work.
Exactly. And it's not just about seeing the problems, it's about understanding how they're connected to larger structures of power and inequality.
This reminds me of that photographic debt idea we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
How can we use what we're learning from these photos to start paying back that debt? What can we do to make sure we're not just passively looking at these images?
That's a really important question. I think one of the first steps is to simply become more aware, more critical viewers of photographs, especially those that show urban environments.
So asking questions like, who took this picture? Why? What's the context?
Exactly. And also, what's not in this picture? What stories aren't being told? Who benefits from this image being shared? And who might be silenced?
It's like we need to learn a whole new way of reading photographs.
I agree. And I think Wiley's article gives us a framework for doing that. It encourages us to think about photography not just as art or documentation, but as a tool for understanding power inequality and social justice.
It's amazing how one article can really change how you see things.
Yeah, for sure.
Before we started this deep dive, I mostly thought of Baltimore like how The Wire showed it, all that drama and grit. But now after going through Elvin Wyly's work, I'm seeing the city in a whole new light. I get the history, the struggles, the resilience in a much deeper way.
It's true. The Wire gives you a little taste of Baltimore, but it's just that, a taste.
Right.
What Wiley does so well is show us how photography, when you really look at it, can help us uncover the stories that are usually hidden. The systemic stuff that affects everyday people's lives.
And it's not just about focusing on the bad stuff, right? The article also talks about the strength and spirit of the people, their ability to find hope and build community, even when things are really tough.
Oh, absolutely. Think about that picture of the Thank God for Jesus Church. Even in the middle of hardship and those predatory lending practices, there's this incredible faith and determination.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that while we need to understand what creates inequality, we also need to recognize the power that communities have to fight back and build something better.
Exactly. And that's where I think Wiley's call to action comes in. He's not just saying, be critical of photos. He's saying, become active in shaping how our cities are seen.
So it's about more than just understanding the problems. It's about using what we learn to make a difference.
Exactly. And he doesn't just give us these vague ideas. He gives us real steps we can take.
Like what kind of steps are we talking about?
Well, he wants us to think about our own cities, to grab our cameras and start documenting the stories happening all around us.
I love that. Instead of just looking at pictures, we become the storytellers, shining a light on the things that matter most to us.
Right. And it's not just about taking pictures. It's about asking those important questions we've been talking about. Like, what's the context of this picture? What's being shown and what's left out? Who benefits from this story and who might be silenced?
It's about using photography as a tool for social change, to raise awareness, start conversations, and inspire action.
Exactly. And it's something anyone can do, no matter where you live or what your background is.
This whole conversation has been really inspiring. It's like we got these new lenses now, not just for looking at pictures, but for understanding the world around us.
And I hope our listeners keep using those lenses long after this episode ends.
This deep dive has been eye-opening. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and taking us through Elvin Wyly's work. It's been fascinating.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, we all have the power to change how our cities are seen. So get out there, explore, document, and use your voices and your cameras to create a more just and fair world for everyone.
Those are words to live by. Thanks for listening, everyone. And if you want to dig even deeper, be sure to check out Elvin Wyly's article, Things Pictures Don't Tell Us, In Search of Baltimore. You can find it in the Journal City from 2010.
It's a great read.
Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.